Everyone, joining me now is Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator, thanks so much for being with us. I wonder what you make of the day in its entirety.
Yeah, well, Nicole, this was really compelling testimony by former FBI Director Jim Comey. What I saw was a seasoned senior former federal law enforcement leader, former prosecutor, who was very measured and very careful in what he had to say today. First off the top, he reinforced that there is no dispute about whether Russia, with the direction of Vladimir Putin, interfered in our 2016 election. And because they've paid no real price for having done so, they will come again. They will come after us in our 2018 and 2020 elections. They are currently interfering with our allies' elections in Europe. And if we don't come together in a bipartisan way to address this threat to our democracy, shame on us, first. Second, he recounted, as you've discussed with your panel recently here, some pretty alarming allegations that the president either didn't know or didn't care what the appropriate separation between a partisan elected president and the head of the FBI should be. And he crossed that line repeatedly, making unethical or inappropriate efforts to direct Comey to shut down the investigation into former National Security Advisor and General Mike Flynn, and to ask for his personal loyalty rather than what's appropriate, which is the FBI director to pledge his loyalty to the Constitution.
Senator, I want to ask you, I'm glad you brought this back to Russia, because I feel like very quickly after the testimony ended, everyone sort of went to their corners and started staring at trees instead of looking at the forest. And what Jim Comey did expertly today was to remind us that Russia is coming after us and that we weaken ourselves. Ambassador McFaul also made the point that when we fight amongst ourselves, we weaken ourselves in the eyes of everyone, but also in the eyes of the Russians. I wonder how we can strengthen ourselves, how we can get to the bottom of this, and what you need this administration to do to cooperate. Would you advocate for granting someone like Mike Flynn immunity so you can get to the bottom of this more quickly? I know that hasn't, I'm not sure that's been put to your committee, but I know that was put to the Senate Intel Committee, and they rejected his request for immunity.
Well, first to that point, I think that's a decision that has to be made very carefully and in consultation with Special Counsel Bob Mueller. You may remember during the Iran-Contra hearings and investigations that ultimately it was because of a congressional grant of immunity that the conviction of Oliver North and others were set aside because that immunity ultimately was seen as being in conflict with their conviction through a criminal process. So I'd want to make sure that we step carefully in the immunity granting conversation. But what should we be doing? First, to me, it's outrageous that this administration is allegedly considering giving back to the Russians the two properties that they enjoyed use of for decades and from which they arguably derive some intelligence benefit in the suburbs of New York and of Washington. This was among the only punishments that the Obama administration was able to mete out against the Russians for their interference in our election before President Obama left office, kicking them out of those two properties and imposing sanctions. There is a bipartisan bill, of which I'm a co-sponsor in the Senate, that would make it much more difficult for President Trump to lift the sanctions against Russia. And there's a bipartisan bill, of which I'm also a co-sponsor, that has 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats on it that would impose new sanctions on Russia. That has a waiver provision that would make it possible for the president to demonstrate that there's been some progress in addressing relations with Russia. In the panel that you just had, it was really striking that the gentleman there representing the Trump transition team seemed to say, well, why is everyone all concerned about Russia? It's completely appropriate that during the transition, Jared Kushner allegedly tried to open a back channel with Moscow, with the Kremlin, through the Russian embassy. Well, let's just review that for a moment. In recent years, Vladimir Putin and Russia have invaded and occupied the territory of a neighboring country, Crimea in Ukraine. They've taken the side of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and arguably committed war crimes by targeting their bombing against civilians. And they've interfered in the elections of our vital allies in Europe, most recently France, and they've repeatedly tried to undermine the upcoming elections in Germany. This isn't limited to the United States. Their aggression against our NATO allies and against our democracy is just part of a larger plan of aggression by Vladimir Putin's Russia, and why this administration would choose to make a sharp departure from long-standing Republican Party policy and cozy up to this authoritarian regime is beyond me, and is part of why, on a bipartisan basis, there's a lot of questions here in Washington about why the Trump administration is so supportive of closer relations with Vladimir Putin.
Yep, and you can draw the string all the way back to the changes in the GOP platform. I could talk to you all afternoon. I really appreciate you spending some time with us. Thank you.